The young and the restless spoilers shock in the glittering heart of Paris, where the skyline shimmered under the waning twilight and a sea of influential elites gathered to toast the beginning of a new corporate era. The last thing anyone expected was the arrival of a dying man. The grand ballroom of the historic chateau had been transformed into a scene of opulence and spectacle, filled with music, candlelight, and anticipation. Kane stood tall in the center of it all, the architect of the night's splendor, exuding the charisma and control of someone who knew he was on the verge of conquering something much bigger than a company. And yet, despite the elegance, despite the flowing champagne and strategic whispers exchanged behind tuxedoed backs, an undercurrent of something darker was looming, something uninvited, unaccounted for, and emotionally catastrophic. Far away from the grandeur, Claire and Victoria had been absent from Genoa City for several days. Their silence, their distance, had not gone unnoticed, but no one dared question the weight of what they were fleeing from. They had left behind a crumbling situation, not just with Cole's rapidly deteriorating condition, but with their own fractured emotions. They had not spoken much about him. Not about the disease slowly devouring his strength. Not about the letters he had written but never sent. Not about the silence they had returned to him in the form of neglect. Perhaps they assumed he was in safe hands. Perhaps they simply could not face the truth. But the truth, as always, had a habit of following those who ran from it. Cole had made a decision, one born of desperation, not pride. Refusing treatment, refusing medication, refusing the sterile inevitability of dying alone in a hospital bed, he had torn the 4 from his arm and bought himself a one-way ticket to Paris. No one knew how he'd made it through the airports, how he endured the endless walk through terminals and the suffocating silence of being surrounded by strangers. Each breath had been agony. Each movement was a battle against time, against his own failing body. But he had to see them. He had to look Claire in the eyes. He had to say goodbye to Victoria not with a letter or a voicemail, but in the flesh, because even if they had left him behind, he had never stopped loving them. When he stepped into the ballroom, chaos did not erupt immediately. At first, it was confusion, heads turning toward the open doors, unsure if this gaunt, pale man staggering toward the crowd was a member of staff or an intruder. Then came the collective gasp. Claire dropped her wine glass, the crystal shattering like a scream that no one had yet voiced. Victoria stumbled forward, her heels catching on the hem of her gown as her breath caught in her throat. Cole was there, truly there, ghost-like, unshaven, barely recognizable, yet undeniably real. The agony written across his face eclipsed the beauty of the room. He clutched his chest, eyes frantic as if searching for one final anchor before the storm took him. And then, he collapsed. The music stopped. The lights seemed to dim on their own. Claire and Victoria ran to him in tandem, falling to their knees as he lay crumpled on the marble floor, his breathing shallow and erratic. Claire sobbed uncontrollably, calling his name, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. Victoria tried to steady his trembling hand, her fingers shaking just as badly. He looked at them both, eyes gleaming not with resentment, but a tragic relief. He had made it. He had seen them. The pain didn't matter now. The betrayal didn't matter. Only presence did. Guests began to murmur. Someone called for an ambulance, but Cole already knew it was too late. He wasn't there to be saved, he was there to deliver something. And in the final seconds of his life, he did. With his final breath, he whispered a name, Kane. It wasn't just the name. It was the way he said it. Laced with fear. With warning. With the gravity of something long buried but monstrous. Then, his body stilled, and the room fell into a silence that felt like mourning wrapped in dread. Victoria let out a scream that echoed through the ballroom, a wail of grief and guilt tangled in decades of unresolved pain. Claire couldn't speak. She just rocked back and forth, her tears soaking the lapel of Cole's wrinkled shirt. And Kane, who had been smiling moments earlier, stood frozen, the name Cole had uttered reverberating through him like a curse. For those who noticed, there was a change in his demeanor. Not quite fear. Not quite surprise. But recognition. He excused himself quietly, slipping into the crowd as emergency responders arrived too late. As guests tried to make sense of what had just occurred, as whispers swirled around the timing, the place, the choice of words, Kane disappeared into the shadows of the chateau, a man suddenly cast under a new light. What secret had Cole carried with him across the ocean? Why had he chosen that moment to speak Kane's name? What did he know, what did he fear, so deeply that he believed it had to be shared with his final breath? For Victoria and Claire, grief was now inseparable from mystery. The man they had failed to stand beside in his last days had delivered a warning they couldn't ignore. And now, amidst the mourning, amidst the brokenness, a new obsession began to bloom, unraveling the truth behind Cole's death and the man he feared most. Kane, for his part, returned to his private suite hours later, where a solitary glass of scotch waited for him. He stared at the mirror, expressionless, before slowly unbuttoning his shirt. On his chest, beneath layers of designer fabric, was an old tattoo, faded, obscure, but symbolically tied to an identity he had abandoned long ago. One he never expected Cole to uncover. One he thought had been buried with the ashes of his past. But Cole, dying and desperate, had seen something. Or someone. And in doing so, had set into motion a reckoning that no amount of power or preparation could stop. The next morning, headlines around the world would focus on the tragic death of Cole Howard, literary icon and former executive, who collapsed and died at a private gala in Paris surrounded by family and friends. What they wouldn't mention, what only a few in that room understood, was that Cole didn't come to Paris just to say goodbye. He came to reveal something. Something about Kane that could burn everything to the ground. Victoria refused to leave Paris. She couldn't. Not without answers. She stayed in Cole's hotel room, surrounded by his notebooks, half-written letters, and photographs taken in secret. Claire took to retracing Cole's steps, interviewing airline staff, hotel managers, and even taxi drivers. The more they dug, the clearer it became, Cole had been chasing the truth. And whatever that truth was, it terrified him enough to risk dying alone in a foreign city just to warn them. In the weeks that followed, whispers about Kane began to grow louder. Old contacts from his time overseas. Hidden bank accounts. A connection to a man who had once gone missing from a government database. The dots were faint, but they were there. And Claire, wounded and unrelenting, vowed that she would connect them all. She owed it to Cole. She owed it to herself. What had started as a lavish evening of celebration had become a vortex of grief, mystery, and suspicion. Cole's death had not been peaceful, it had been purposeful. And his final act had rewritten the script of every life he touched. The question was no longer whether Kane had secrets. The question was whether those secrets were worth killing for. And whether Claire and Victoria were willing to risk everything to expose them. Because in Genoa City, nothing stays buried forever. And ghosts, especially those that die speaking your name, have a way of clawing their way back into the light. Claire hadn't moved in hours. She sat in the corner of the suite where Cole had spent his final night, her eyes locked on the spot where his journal lay half open on the bed, pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from the balcony door. Paris had never felt so cold. Not even during its grayest winters. Not even when she had wandered its streets alone, burdened by identity crises and haunted by the things she had done. But tonight, the cold came from within, the chill of truth brushing against her skin like a knife, the bitter realization that the man she trusted most in the room downstairs might very well be the monster Cole had tried to warn them about. Victoria sat across from her, equally shaken, though she attempted to appear composed. She was gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her eyes unfocused and hollow. What they had seen, what they had heard, could not be unheard. They were not just grieving a man. They were grappling with a revelation that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice laced with panic, rage, and a depth of hurt she had buried long ago. "He's a monster, Victoria. Kane is a monster. Don't you see that now? Don't you dare trust him. Don't let that smile fool you. Don't let that voice lull you into believing he's on our side." Victoria looked up, startled by the vehemence in Claire's voice, but not surprised by the words. Because deep down, she had started to suspect it too. Cole's final breath had not been a plea. It had been a warning. Not of love lost, not of personal regret, but of danger, imminent, suffocating, and close. They hadn't told anyone. No one had heard Cole whisper Kane's name but them. No one had seen the fear in his eyes or the way his hand trembled as he reached out in desperation, as if needing them to carry a burden too heavy to name aloud. And they hadn't told a soul because something about it felt cursed, as if speaking it aloud would invoke whatever evil Cole had tried to escape. It wasn't just grief paralyzing them, it was terror. Because in that fleeting moment, they had both understood that knowing the truth might cost them their lives. Kane, meanwhile, resumed his role as the charismatic host, masking whatever tremors might have been coursing through him behind a polished exterior. He spoke with diplomats and entrepreneurs, toasted investors, and never once mentioned Cole's name again. It was as if the man had died in another reality. And that dissonance? That refusal to acknowledge the emotional carnage still dripping from the marble floor was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. Because only a true predator could step over a corpse and continue smiling as if nothing had happened. The more Claire replayed the moment in her mind, the more certain she became that something darker lay beneath Kane's success story. Cole had known something. Maybe it was something from their past. Maybe it was something that had followed them into the present. Perhaps it had something to do with the sudden acquisitions, the strange silences, the coded phone calls, or the files Cole had been trying to decrypt before his condition became terminal. There had been signs, hadn't there? Moments of hesitation in Kane's stories. Gaps in timelines. People who knew him under different names. Bank accounts registered to shell corporations. Maybe Cole had uncovered the truth too late. Or maybe he had always known, but lacked the strength to confront it until his dying breath. Claire stared at the journal again, remembering the way Cole had tried to speak between gasps of pain, his eyes burning with urgency. "Don't trust Kane," he had said with his eyes, even if his lips hadn't formed the words. And the way he'd whispered his name, not with accusation, but with despair, lingered in her ears like a death rattle. "Do you think we're next?" she asked suddenly, her voice quieter now. "Do you think he saw us hear it?" Victoria didn't respond. Her silence was an answer in itself. Downstairs, the party had resumed, though it was quieter now, more cautious, the memory of Cole's collapse still lingering like smoke. But amidst the resumed conversations and resumed music, there were eyes watching. Claire felt them. Victoria felt them. And perhaps Kane knew that too. Perhaps that was why he never asked what Cole had said. He already knew. And that knowledge made him more dangerous than ever. As night bled into morning, Claire finally opened Cole's journal. What she saw sent a cold shiver through her spine. There were pages covered in sketches, maps, faces, dates. There was a diagram connecting companies in Switzerland, Dubai, and Singapore. There were references to a man named Ariston K, and a cipher she couldn't yet decode. And there, scribbled furiously in Cole's shaky handwriting, was one sentence that felt less like a revelation and more like a prophecy: Kane is not his real name. He is the last ghost from the program. And he's coming for all of us. Claire dropped the journal. Her heart pounded in her ears. What program? Who was Ariston? And how did this all link back to Genoa City? Victoria read over her shoulder, her face growing paler with every word. They both knew this was no longer just about Cole's death. It was about survival. About history. About blood. Had Cole been the writer foreshadowing his own demise all along? Was his death the sacrifice he once alluded to in a speech about legacy? And if so, was his final chapter just the beginning of something far more dangerous? The question now wasn't just who is Kane. It was how many more bodies will fall before the rest of the story is told? The maze had never looked more alive than it did in the hush of that early morning. Damp from last night's rain, the hedges glistened in the soft sunlight, their emerald green darkened by moisture, the scent of earth still rich in the air. Audra stepped into it without hesitation, her heels silent on the gravel path. She had walked this garden countless times before, but something about this morning felt uncharted. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was pregnant with potential, with something yet to be said or discovered. Then, through the lattice of shrubs and ivy, she spotted him. Kyle, shirtless, his muscles taut, was doing push-ups on the flagstone clearing at the heart of the maze, his body rising and falling in rhythmic control. Every motion was calculated, almost defiant, as though he were exercising not just for strength but for dominance over something intangible, over time, over emotion, over himself. Audra paused in the shadows, her arms crossed, watching him with an expression that might have been amusement, curiosity, or perhaps something more dangerous. She was not alone. A rustle behind her announced Sally's arrival, her red hair pulled into a carefree twist, her expression casual but alert. Sally caught sight of Kyle and smirked, leaning in toward Audra with a whisper that was light in tone but barbed with implication. Something tells me we're not admiring the same view. Audra didn't turn to look at her. She kept her gaze fixed on Kyle, then gave a small, ambiguous shrug. Just keeping tabs on a colleague, she replied, her voice steady, devoid of warmth or denial. Sally raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The two women watched him in silence for a few moments longer, not speaking, letting the sound of exertion and breath fill the space. Then Kyle noticed them. He didn't stop. Instead, he completed another set with a little extra flourish before sitting back on his heels and wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Well, he said, slightly breathless but still in control, didn't expect an audience. Audra stepped forward first. We didn't expect to find you out here either. It's a beautiful day though, especially after last night's storm. Kyle nodded, glancing up at the pale sky overhead. The rain had scrubbed everything clean. The air felt raw and fresh, the kind of atmosphere that made secrets feel closer to the surface, more difficult to contain. No cell service, Sally commented, holding up her phone. It's like we're all off the grid. Maybe that's a good thing, Kyle replied, rising to his feet, stretching his arms behind his head. Keeps the noise out. Makes people real again. Audra tilted her head. People at home are probably wondering where we are. But they'll survive, Sally added with a wink. They moved as a trio now, stepping over the cobblestones toward a stone bench nestled under a flowering archway. The conversation turned lighter, casual, aimless, but beneath the surface, tensions were shifting. Kyle mentioned the new arrivals from the night before, his voice betraying mild surprise that Chance had shown up with the Baldwins. Wasn't expecting that dynamic, he said, pouring himself a glass of water from a nearby pitcher. Audra's brows furrowed faintly. There are a lot of unexpected dynamics happening lately. Kyle gave her a look that was unreadable, then without a word walked to the edge of the small pool nearby and stepped in. The water rippled outward from him as he submerged up to his waist, letting out a long breath. It wasn't about relaxation, it was about control again. Temperature. Reaction. Stillness. Audra watched him, her eyes narrowing just slightly, betraying a moment of thought she didn't voice. Sally nudged her gently. Don't forget, Nate's still at home. Faithful as ever, right? Audra's face didn't flinch. There's nothing happening with Kyle, she said coolly, brushing a piece of lint off her blouse. My interest in him is purely professional. Sally raised both eyebrows, unconvinced. Sure. Like his shirtlessness is part of a quarterly report? Audra didn't respond. She simply turned her gaze back toward the pool, toward Kyle, who was now running his hands back through his wet hair. The sunlight hit the water just right, throwing fractured beams across his shoulders. She studied him with the same intensity she'd use when reading a confidential file, trying to see what others missed, trying to understand the part of the story that wasn't being told. Whatever the truth was, Audra wasn't going to admit it, not to Sally, not even to herself. She had built a career on secrets, on controlling the narrative before anyone else knew there was one to control. And yet here, in the quiet heart of a maze where the world had lost its signal, something inside her felt exposed, unsure, even vulnerable. She didn't like it. Which meant it mattered. The conversation lulled as they sat quietly, each with their own thoughts. Above them, birds sang as if nothing had changed. Below, beneath the surface of the polished interactions, the maze of human emotion continued to twist, full of paths that led nowhere and turns that revealed things best left hidden. Audra knew this much. She was already deeper into something with Kyle than she had planned. And the real danger wasn't that someone might find out, it was that she might start to care. And caring, in her world, was the fastest path to losing everything. Because in Genoa City, nothing stays professional for long. And no secret stays buried forever.